Let's get started. We're really excited that you've all joined us this afternoon to launch our report, A Portrait of Louisiana 2020, for this webinar and virtual panel discussion. My name's Jonas, and before I turn things over to our speaker and panelists, I just want to review a few quick housekeeping items. Today's webinar and discussion is scheduled for 90 minutes. We'll end at 5 p.m. Central Time, and the session will be recorded. The audience lines will be listen only. However, we do encourage you to submit any questions you have for speakers throughout the session as you think of them by clicking on the Q&A link, which should be at the bottom of your screen. For those of you joining us on Facebook Live, you can also add comments, and we'll make sure to get those to our panelists during the question and answer portion. If you have any trouble accessing this event on Zoom, you can always find this event on Facebook Live on Louisiana Budget Programs page. You'll also be able to access a recording of this event, which will be hosted on our website alongside our hosts at the LSU Riley Center. At the end of the event today, you'll also receive a link in your email to order a print copy of this report for free. Just provide us with your shipping address and we'll send it over to you in a few weeks. So now I'm going to turn things over to our director, Kristen Lewis, Measure of America's co-founder and director. Kristen.
Thanks so much, Jonas. Can everybody hear me? Yep. Okay, great. And thank you so much to all of you for joining us today, especially given the storm. Our thoughts are with everyone in Louisiana affected by the hurricane today. Special thanks to the Louisiana Budget Project and to the LSU Riley Center for Media and Public Affairs for their partnership and for co-hosting today. We really, really appreciate it. So before I turn things over to Jan Moeller, Executive Director for the Louisiana Budget Project, to lead our panel discussion, I'll first share with you the key findings of the report. Just going to share my screen. Okay, sorry, this always takes a little bit of time. Here we go. Okay, great. So I am absolutely thrilled to be here today to tell you about the Portrait of Louisiana 2020. Again, many thanks to the Louisiana Budget Project and the Riley Center for hosting us today. Sincere thanks to our, so first let me just tell you what I'm gonna do. So I'll tell you a little bit about our project, the results of our work. I'll give you some sample findings of the key things we found in health, education, earnings, youth disconnection, and incarceration. And then I'll conclude with some recommendations. And just to say, there's a lot more in the report than what I'll say today, but there are like a gazillion numbers and many, many findings. So it's just going to be a brief kind of overview today. First, sincere thanks to our funders, without whom this project would not be possible. A special shout out to Elizabeth Chung and Jana Sitkar with the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation and Erica Wright of JP Morgan Chase. We're also incredibly grateful and indebted to our amazing advisors. We had about 50 advisors for this project. Their names are scrolling by right now. They were unbelievably generous with their time and ideas. They saved us from ourselves on many, many occasions. So thank you so much to all of them. And I'd also like to just give a quick shout out to the great Measure of America team, whose dedication and creativity never fail to amaze me. So thanks so much to my dear colleagues. So just a word on who we are. Measure of America is part of the nearly century-old Social Science Research Council. We write reports like this one, including a first portrait of Louisiana in 2009. We do research on youth disconnection, and we create online mapping and data tools. And our main thing we care about is the well-being of people. So let me just give you a rundown of the basics for this report. We wanted to revisit the 2009 report. We wanted to take a particular look at young people and how they're doing in Louisiana. As I said earlier, we have findings for different places in the state, as well as for racial and ethnic groups. And we have some focus on 4 cities in Louisiana. So we were working on this as COVID appeared, of course. So the report also explores the potential impacts of COVID-19, and it frames our findings as creating a vulnerabilities map in terms of the communities and groups most at risk during and after the pandemic. So before I tell you about our findings, I just want to say a few words about our approach. So we are inspired and guided by the human development approach. It's an optimistic, hopeful concept that puts human freedom and human dignity at the center. It emphasizes the everyday experience of ordinary people, and it's really about what regular people can do and be in their lives. Whereas the traditional approach to understanding progress using economic metrics like GDP asks, how is the economy doing? The human development approach asks how people are doing. So the idea draws very heavily on the work of Nobel laureate Amartya Sen using his capabilities approach as a conceptual framework. So capabilities can be understood as our toolkit for living a freely chosen life of value. This idea was pioneered at the United Nations, and our work is based on the UN Human Development Report series. Another very important idea underpinning particularly this report is the concept of human security. Whereas human development can be thought of as the freedom to live a freely chosen life, human security can be thought of as freedom from chronic and sudden threats to our lives, rights, safety, and dignity. And human security really came to the foreground this year in terms of COVID-19, the economic collapse, the hurricanes that you all have been experiencing in Louisiana, and police violence and mass incarceration and the outcry against these things that we've seen throughout the year. So the concept of human development is really broad and very far-reaching. It includes all the things that shape the opportunities open to us, from our family situation to our religious beliefs to our ability to participate in the decisions that affect us. There's really no way to measure all of these things at once. So the American Human Development Index just measures 3 core capabilities: a long and healthy life, access to knowledge, and a decent standard of living. So people around the world see these as the basic building blocks of well-being and opportunity. So we take these 3 areas, we have proxy measures for each. So health, we use life expectancy at birth, which we calculate from mortality data that we receive from the Louisiana Department of Health. Education, we use 2 indicators: degree attainment for the population age 25 and older, and school enrollment for the population ages 3 to 24. And we get this information from the American Community Survey of the US Census Bureau. And income, we use median personal earnings. So that's the wages and salaries of all workers, full and part-time, ages 16 and up. This also comes from the American Community Survey. If we add all these measures together and divide by 3, we get the index score. So the score goes from 0 to 10, 10 being high. We then disaggregate the population by geography and by demographic group. So kind of a lengthy introduction, but I just wanted to make sure everyone understands what we're measuring and how we're measuring it. So if we look first of all at Louisiana over time, our last report was in 2009, and at that time, the Human Development Index score was 3.92. It's now 4.35, so it's gone up. In terms of areas of particular progress, there's been a big drop in the share of adults ages 25 and up who lack a high school degree. So that's been a huge change. It used to be about 20%, and now it's only 14%. There's also been a big increase in the share of adults with bachelor's degrees. And just to say that these overall indicators, they obscure huge variation by race and place, and that's going to be the subject of the rest of the presentation. And just note, we figured out the Human Development Index score back to 1990. So in 1990, the score, so it was 30 years ago, the score was 3.15. I'm just noting that because you're going to see as we go through that many groups and places today have scores that are lower even than that. Okay, so here we see, of course, a map of Louisiana by parish. The darker colors are more of whatever we're measuring in this whole presentation. So right now, the darker colors are good because we're measuring human development and well-being. So the darker colors represent higher scores. So the top scoring parish is Ascension. The bottom scoring parish is East Carroll. Residents of Ascension Parish live 7 years longer than residents of East Carroll. They earn more than twice as much, and they're 3 times as likely to hold a bachelor's degree. And in general, the areas in Northeast Louisiana are struggling compared to the rest of the state. So here we see the Human Development Index by gender and by race and ethnicity. Men in Louisiana have a higher score than women. Though women live longer than men and have better educational outcomes, men earn much more than women, and this earnings advantage pulls them ahead. The HDI scores of Louisiana's 4 major racial and ethnic groups range from 2.93 for Black residents to 6.29 for Asian residents. So Asians whose score is more than double that of Black Louisianans are the only group to score above the US average. White and Latino residents fall evenly in the middle of the range, and with white Louisianans slightly edging out Louisianans. Because of the small size of the Asian population in the state, we were unable to calculate life expectancy for Asian women and Asian men separately. And thus we don't have Human Development Index scores by gender for these two groups. So here we see the different racial and ethnic groups on the line. You're seeing that white men are high. They are still below Asian women and men together. But the reason that white men are doing so well is they have such higher earnings. They earn much more than any other group. So we were able to calculate the Human Development Index by census tract for 4 cities in Louisiana. Here we see Baton Rouge. The bottom is the Estruma area or neighborhood in Baton Rouge, and the top is Kenilworth. So Estruma has a score of 0.55, less than 1. So just think again about the score for Louisiana as a whole in 1990, which was 3.15. So this area of Baton Rouge today is far behind even what the state was 30 years ago. This was the lowest score that we found in Louisiana, and actually I think the lowest score we've ever seen. This is the Human Development Index in Monroe. Claiborne tract is at the top with a score of 6.67. The bottom, Lameville neighborhood, which is again a score less than 1, 0.98. Here we see the Human Development Index by census tract in New Orleans, the top being Lakeview, and the bottom being the Fisher Development neighborhood. And again, a huge disparity. So, and then here is New Orleans, the Human Development Index by race and gender. So in the report, we have this for all 4 cities. We have the racial and ethnic breakdown, which within different places. And it's not the same as it is for the state. So you'll note that for Orleans Parish, for instance, women are scoring higher than men, 5.09 compared to 4.38. So before I go on and tell you some more about our results, I want to talk a little bit about why. Why do we see these huge gaps in well-being, these huge disparities? And I want to sort of challenge what people might be feeling in Louisiana, kind of statistics fatigue. You know, you're seeing these numbers a lot. You're hearing about how Louisiana is lagging behind the country as a whole. And I think that one thing that's really helpful to do is to sort of focus on why that is the case. So really there's nothing inevitable or natural about the kind of inequality that we see in Louisiana. So I have 4 maps for you here. The top 2, if you look at the top 2 maps, the one on the left is an 1860 map showing the proportion of the population that was enslaved at that time. This figure exceeded 70% in nearly every parish along the Mississippi River. And then the map on the right shows the Human Development Index scores by parish today. So parishes along the Mississippi in Northeast Louisiana that historically had the highest share of enslaved people today have the very lowest Human Development Index scores in the state. They have the shortest life expectancies, the lowest levels of educational attainment, and the lowest earnings. So the legacy of slavery, of the Black Codes, of Jim Crow is really clear when you look at these 2 maps. Now let's just look at the bottom 2 maps. So the one on the left is a map of Shreveport that the Homeowner Loan Corporation used to classify neighborhoods for what was called mortgage risk. These classifications blocked non-white communities from receiving federally guaranteed housing loans during the New Deal by labeling low-income and Black neighborhoods as risky investments. So you can see two Shreveport neighborhoods on these maps. They're outlined in black. I don't know if you can see my little arrow moving around or not, but there are two little rectangles outlined in black. The one on the right is South Highland. The one on the left is Cato Heights. So the map on the left shows that South Highlands was in the green zone on this New Deal era housing risk map, whereas the Cato Heights neighborhood was made up of red and yellow zones labeled hazardous or definitely declining. So how does that play out today? Well, the map on the right is a racial dot map showing residential segregation by race. The green dots are the white population, the blue dots are the African American population. And if we look at how people are doing today, so if you look at the Cato Heights neighborhood, 91% of residents today are Black. The Human Development Index score is 1.51. Median personal earnings extremely low, less than $17,000. If you look at the South Highlands neighborhood today, 86% of residents are white. The Human Development Index is 8.55, and median personal earnings are over $60,000. So the legacy of redlining is very much alive today in the reality of people's lives in Shreveport and in other parts of Louisiana, and indeed in other parts of the country. So I just wanted to make that point, that very important point. And throughout the rest of the presentation, I'm also going to talk about other things basically that are as they are because of decisions people in power have made. And I really want to emphasize that we can make different decisions to have different outcomes. So as I mentioned earlier, the index is made up of three components: a long and healthy life, access to knowledge, and median and a decent standard of living. So I'll just give you a couple of highlights for those areas. So here we see life expectancy at birth. So that's a baby, how long a baby born today can expect to live. Women live longer than men in all racial and ethnic groups by an average of about 5 years. And 20 years, 2 decades, separate the life expectancies of Black men and Latino women. So the reason we have these big gaps in life expectancy is very much because of the social determinants of health. So we can really address these differences by making sure that people have green spaces and affordable housing, that they have the things they need to live, that they have access to full service grocery stores and affordable health care, that they have jobs with decent wages, and that they are treated fairly under the law, things like this. So a lot of these things that don't seem health related are actually prescriptions for better health. And they're things that we can address with policies. In terms of access to knowledge, here we see the education index by parish. Lincoln Parish is at the top. Of course, that makes sense. It's home of Louisiana Tech and Grambling State University. So there are a lot of students there, a lot of professors. And the bottom is East Carroll Parish with a score of 1.28. So just to draw your attention to, for instance, the share of adults with at least a high school diploma, it's less than 70% in East Carroll Parish. And again, what can we do about this? There are a lot of policy levers to pull. So this is just one thing that we found is that state funding per student for post-secondary education dropped between 2008 and 2018 by around $5,000, whereas tuition went up by that same amount during that same period of time. So these arrows are moving in the wrong direction if we want to expand people's choices and opportunities and access to education. In terms of decent standard of living, again, that's median personal earnings. We did a lot of different cuts of the pie in terms of how much people are earning. And one thing we found that was extremely stark is that in every single parish, the median earnings of white workers are higher than the median earnings of Black workers. So if we're taking Ascension Parish, for instance, which has the highest median personal earnings of the parishes, white earnings are close to $50,000, Black earnings just a little bit over $31,000. And all of these dots represent all of the parishes in Louisiana. We also saw, in addition to this racial earnings gap, a huge gender earnings gap. In Louisiana, the median for all residents in terms of median personal earnings is around $31,000. But there's about $10,000 more than that for men in Louisiana, less than that for women in Louisiana, creating a gap of over $15,000. And the gap varies by race and ethnicity. The gap is largest among white workers, and that's due to the extremely high earnings of white men, nearly $50,000. So white men earn about $20,000 more than their female counterparts. The smallest earnings gap is found among Black Louisianans, and that's not because Black women earn so much more, it's because Black men have lower earnings than men of other racial and ethnic groups. And so again, why is this? There's nothing natural about the earnings gap between women and men. And we can close the gender earnings gap by changing norms, enacting and enforcing laws, implementing leave policies. Basically, all along the life course, you see places, key inflection points where the wages and salaries of women and men diverge. Women and men, or girls and boys, study different things. They have different career paths. Men are overrepresented, for instance, in STEM fields, which are very high paying. When couples choose to have children, caretaking really cracks it wide open. And we see huge difference in terms of earnings. Women's earnings go down for every child they have, men's earnings go up. And then there are things to do with workplace culture, sexual harassment, straight up wage discrimination. So by the time men and women retire, they have really different earnings, which has huge impact, not just for them as individuals, but for their families. So a third of Louisiana families are headed by single moms. Obviously, their earnings really matter. But even families headed by married or cohabitating couples, women's earnings are critically important. They're not like pin money for extras. Women's earnings keeps the lights on, they put gas in the car, they pay the rent. So women's earnings matter to families in Louisiana. Another thing that we looked at in particular for this report was youth disconnection. All of our advisors said this is a very important issue in Louisiana. So youth disconnection matters to human development because this is the time when people develop the capabilities they need for a flourishing, freely chosen life. It's when they earn degrees, when they start building networks, when they learn about themselves and their own skills and preferences, and so forth. And so young people ages 16 to 24 who are out of school and out of work are really missing out on fundamental experiences that will affect them later in their lives. In terms of the youth disconnection by parish, again, the highest rate is in East Carroll Parish, where like an astonishing 3 in 4 young people 16 to 24 are out of school and out of work. And the lowest rate is in Lincoln Parish, where of course, most young people of that age are enrolled in high school or many of the colleges and universities there. We see a huge variation by race and gender in terms of youth disconnection. Black young men have by far the highest rate, 27%. This is much higher than the state, which is 16.4%, higher than any other racial and ethnic group. So in general, girls and young women have lower disconnection rates than boys and young men. This is true for Black young people in Louisiana. The opposite is true though for Latinos. So Latina young women have higher disconnection rates than Latino young men. And that's true in Louisiana. It's also true in the country as a whole. In terms of disconnection over time, so Louisiana has the 4th highest rate of youth disconnection. The top line is Louisiana young people. The bottom line is the national rate. So that big spike you see is the Great Recession. And right now we don't have data yet on what's happening right now, but we are pretty certain that the rate is going to skyrocket because of COVID-19. Unlike the Great Recession, which sort of affected employment, COVID-19 is affecting both school enrollment and employment, which are the two pieces of youth disconnection. So we anticipate that the rate is skyrocketing to maybe 1 in 4 young people. In terms of incarceration, we looked at incarceration because it's a tremendously important human development issue. And again, we see that incarceration is a huge issue in Northeast Louisiana in particular. So the place with the highest youth disconnection rate also has the highest jail admissions rate. So that's the number of people, not who are held at any one time, but who are being admitted into jail, is 4 times as high as the population itself. And you can see a very close link between jail admissions and the youth disconnection rate, and also the Human Development Index. So the prison admission rates are much higher in parishes with low human development scores. And again, so why is this and what can we do about it? Well, one reason that in particular Black young men and boys and young men are in jail so disproportionately is because of school and neighborhood policies and practices. So we can do things like eliminate zero tolerance policies, stop punishing Black boys and men and girls as well to exclusionary punishments like being expelled from school. In terms of neighborhood and society, Black young people have disproportionate arrests, they have harsher charges, and so on. So we can change these policies, we can change these practices and make better decisions that lead to fairer and more just outcomes. So those were our findings. We also made some recommendations in the report. The 3 kind of not exactly low-hanging fruit, but 3 areas that we can act on relatively quickly. The first is targeting COVID-19 recovery to groups and community with scores below 3.0. So 3.15 was the score in 1990. There are lots of population groups and places in Louisiana today with scores below 3. They were hardest hit by COVID and the economic collapse, and they faced the steepest barriers to recovery. So that we really need to target those areas that have such low well-being scores with any kind of recovery programs and aid. We need to address the critical needs of opportunity youth. So this means helping them stay in school with all the programs. There are programs that exist that help kids stay in school and address the needs of out-of-school youth, help bring them back. Opportunity youth are particularly hard hit economically right now because things like the CARES Act didn't really get to them. So they're struggling on many levels right now. And then we really need to invest in transportation and broadband infrastructure. So we have to start treating broadband like a utility akin to electricity rather than some kind of luxury good. And we really saw during COVID-19 how critically important broadband is to school, to work, to telehealth, and so forth. So it's a real priority for the state, as is investing in transportation. There are many parts of the state that don't have any public transportation. And if you're without a car, you can't really get to school, you can't get to educational opportunities or jobs and so forth. In the longer haul, the state has to do more to build human security by addressing chronic threats like discrimination, gender-based violence, and so forth, and also by being prepared for sudden emergencies. And if there was ever a year for sudden emergencies, unfortunately, this one has really been it. Addressing systemic racism and the long and serious legacy of slavery is critical. Of course, it's a long-term project, but it's one that needs very direct attention. And then decreasing incarceration dramatically and reforming the criminal justice system is also a priority. And lastly, we made recommendations in each of the 3 areas of the index. I'm just going to pop them up there for a second and not really read through them. We explore them at length in the report, but just to say for long and healthier lives, really investing in making the conditions of daily life better in terms of access to knowledge, really focusing on our youngest children with home visitation, universal pre-K, keeping high school students in school, having good CTE programs and so forth. And in terms of improving living standards, really addressing the deep and persistent poverty we see, particularly in Northeast Louisiana and in urban neighborhoods in our big cities, and closing those racial and gender earnings gaps. So again, just to hammer home this point again, is that there's nothing natural or inevitable about the inequality we see in this report, and that different policy choices can create a different, better, and fairer future for everybody in Louisiana. So thank you very much. And I believe that we are now going to open it up to questions. Yes?
Yes, so if you have any questions for Kristen, please drop them in the Q&A box. We're just going to take a couple minutes to clarify anything that's come up over the course of this presentation. And I'll go ahead and start with one that we got during the presentation. Kristen, somebody is asking about the impact of wage theft on Latino men and women in Louisiana. And I would just like to clarify that wage theft would be reflected in the earnings findings that we publish because they're from the American Community Survey. So those are self-reported earnings. So those median personal earnings would be showing the difference between would be showing the total that they earn after wage theft.
Yes. And we didn't look specifically at that issue of wage theft, though we do understand that for Latino workers, it's a huge issue. And I think it's probably something we're seeing reflected in particular in women's earnings, because Latino women have the lowest earnings of all the racial and ethnic groups in Louisiana.
Someone else, Abby Hughes Holsclaw, is asking where debt shows up in the Human Development Index.
Okay, so the Human Development Index, we would love to include assets. That would be great. Unfortunately, it's very hard to get information about assets, especially down to like census tract or county level. This information isn't really collected very much. It misses the top earners who often don't participate in surveys and so forth. And also the value of assets changes all the time. So, you know, your housing value maybe goes up and down. The stock portfolios change. So the data are really poor in general on assets. Now the difference in assets dwarfs the difference in wages. So, you know, for instance, in New Orleans, the median housing value for white families is more than double the median housing value for Black families. So we see these huge, huge disparities in wealth, and we do talk about them quite a bit in the report, but they are not part of the index just because of for data reasons.
Someone else is asking, will we share hard copies of this report with every state legislature? We would absolutely love if you would put those into their hands. I think it'd be more important that it comes from your hands as their constituents. And we'll be sharing that link for a free hard copy at the end of this presentation. So please give us your shipping details, maybe put your state legislators' details in there too if you want, and we'll send you a free copy to waive at the state legislators.
And we're also working with our partners to have a strategy about distributing hard copies of the report to everyone who should have them. So we would love your thoughts. Please put them in the chat about people in addition to the state legislators that you think should have this report.
And a final question before we start moving on to our panelists. Somebody's asking, how long will it take for increased rates of youth disconnection to show up in the data?
That's a great question. So the data that we use to calculate youth disconnection come out at the end of the year in general. And so, but it's for the previous year. So we are in 2020. So the data we just reported in our most recent report on youth disconnection was from 2018. So there's a lag. We are, however, working to create some estimates at the national level and also by state. And so we hope to release those in a report early next year.
Sweet. And one question was also what other state orgs will be diving deeper with specific state policy recommendations related to the data in this report. And I think to answer that question, we should maybe move on to the panelist section.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue. So
and the other questions remaining in the Q&A box, I'll type out answers to that while we're getting started.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jonas. Now I'm going to hand the mic over to our host at the LSU Riley Center, Janae Slocum. She is actually Dr. Janae Slocum. She's a public policy, communication, and higher educational professional whose passion lies in bringing people and resources together to advance the public good. As the director of the Riley Center for Media and Public Affairs at LSU's Manship School of Mass Communications, Janae applies her expertise and enthusiasm for politics, public policy, and communications to building and shaping the strategic direction of the center and leading outreach and engagement for the Manship School. So over to you, Janae. You are on mute.
Oh, I always do that. Thank you so much, Kristen, for that introduction. I want to share a little bit about the Riley Center really quick. We are the outreach and engagement arm of the LSU Manship School. We engage in research, civic engagement programming, and we put on a lot of events. We have a long history of leadership on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And our intent around this focus area is to contribute to understanding and combating institutional discrimination and the resulting disparities that we see in media and public affairs professions, our electorate, democratic representation, and beyond, which is why one of the reasons we were thrilled to be asked to host this launch of the Measure of America Portrait of Louisiana 2020. This work represents exactly the kind of data analysis necessary to spotlight areas where our state is improving and where we still need to do work. Doing so requires really good analysis, and that is exactly what we have here in this report. Creating good policy also requires good data. With that, I'm going to turn to introducing our panelists today, and I know they can provide an amazing amount of insight. And panelists, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day, and also with Ashley finding a place with power to join us. All of our panelists are incredibly accomplished professionals. I hope they don't mind that I had to cut their bios down just a tiny bit, but let me share a little bit about each one of them. Ashley Shelton is the Executive Director for the Power Coalition for Equity and Justice. The Power Coalition uses a broad-based strategy that combines community organizing, issue advocacy, and civic action, all while increasing the capacity of community organizations throughout the state. Ashley has led both C3 and C4 strategies to motivate voters throughout the state of Louisiana. She's also the former Vice President of Programs at the Louisiana Disaster Recovery Foundation, now the Foundation for Louisiana. In her role there, she managed a system of integrated value-added programs in the aftermath of Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. Now, Devontae Lewis, who is the Director of Public Affairs and Outreach for the Louisiana Budget Project, also known as LBP. LBP monitors and reports on state government spending and how it affects Louisiana's low to moderate income families. His work focuses on higher education policy, monitoring legislative developments, and working with advocacy groups and coalition partners to advance LBP's policy agenda. Prior to joining LBP, he was an elementary school teacher in Atlanta's Coweta County school system, and a fun fact is that his classroom was next door to his mother's classroom. Erica Zucker is the policy advocate for the Workplace Justice Project at Loyola Law Clinic. The LJP's work is rooted in improving economic outcomes for low-wage workers and working families by providing direct legal services and litigating workplace claims. Erica has over 20 years of experience in labor and employment law and advocacy, community engagement, and outreach. At WJP, her work includes directing advocacy programs focusing on challenges faced by low-wage workers in New Orleans and Louisiana, and providing expertise and support for wage claims and worker education. She also develops and maintains relations with federal and state agencies, community and labor organizations, and she builds local and statewide coalitions and alliances. Before moving to New Orleans in 2010, Erica practiced labor and employment law in California, and Erica currently serves on the New Orleans City Council's Equal Pay Advisory Committee. Jan Moeller is Executive Director for the Louisiana Budget Project. Prior to joining LBP in 2011, he was an award-winning journalist with the New Orleans Times-Picayune State Capitol Bureau, where he covered the state budget, healthcare policy, higher education, and races for Louisiana governor and U.S. Senate seats. Prior to that, he covered local and national politics at the Las Vegas Review Journal and worked as a reporter and editor in Washington, D.C. Jan will be moderating our panel discussion today, so I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thank you, Janae, and thank you to our panel for joining us. I couldn't be more excited about this. We couldn't be more honored to be partnering here. Before I get to our questions, I want to just thank Kristen for putting together an absolutely amazing data-rich report. For someone like us who are data geeks, this is just a goldmine of great information. I want to thank JP Morgan Chase, and I especially want to thank the Hilton Foundation for their commitment in Louisiana to addressing the issues around opportunity youth and really bringing these issues to the forefront and helping work on solutions. With that, I also want to remind everybody watching that you can submit your questions in the Q&A box during the discussion, and we will try to get to them during this. But first, I have a couple of questions for all of our panelists. And the first question, I invite all of you to weigh in on this. And it's very simple. What are the implications of this report on your work? Let's start with Ashley.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. This is, Jana couldn't agree more. This is such a great report, data rich, and I think it has several implications on our work. On one hand, I think that there have been some progress. There's been some progress that's been made, and whether that's criminal justice, reform and sustaining that criminal justice reform, but also too, like lots of places where our work must continue. And I think that, one of the things that we don't, that I think this data points out or is connected to is that, for example, Louisiana has the second proportional highest Black population in the country, second only to Georgia. And so when you look at these, like the data and the statistics and the unfortunate place that African Americans find themselves in terms of the Human Development Index, it becomes even more concerning when you've got such a large population of African American folks in our state that are hurting and, not doing well along this Human Development Index. And so I think that for us, what that means is that we've got to keep pushing to build their voices and their power in their communities so that we can start to fix so many of the systemic ways in which, they're trapped in a never-ending cycle of poverty and criminalization. And so we think that, again, like I was, there were some positive things. I had an opportunity to work on the first report when I was with the Louisiana Disaster Recovery Foundation. It's like we were able to address some of the things around infant mortality, but then we see maternal mortality growing. There are these things that we keep trading kind of back and forth as you look at the data over time. And so when I think about Power Coalition and the work that we're doing, it's really about connecting people back to those decision makers in their communities, whether it be elected officials at the local, state, or federal level, and saying, how are we going to be able to systemically, from a policy advocacy perspective, address these issues?
Thank you.
So yeah, not ramble.
Devontae, you want to go next, or?
Sure. I mean,
we're kind of going right to left here.
well, once again, Jan, I want to thank Measure of America for such a great report. As someone who spends a lot of time reading things, this has been a great morning jog read every day. I think when it comes to our work, I think this goes back centered to something that I always talk about, which is policy matters. Louisiana, we know we're known as a state of culture, of love, of happiness, but I think it's time we have to showcase that in policy. We have to take kind of our traits that we want the nation to see us when they visit Louisiana and bring it back home to the people that actually live here. And so I think what the implications of this report showcases, I think Ashley was right. We've made some progress. I mean, I think we've seen that with how Medicaid expansion has changed the health index of people in the state. Over 500,000 people now have access to healthcare that did not have it at the start of 2015. But we're seeing some of the effects of when we aren't talking about the other policies that matter, wages, affordable housing, transportation, and how the system of policy will move our state. I think oftentimes we are really focused on economic development and workforce development, but we don't actually develop the people who build our economy and are central to workforce development. And I think this is what this report is highlighting, is how we can't leave people out of policy conversations. We cannot leave people out of the discussions of how we move the state forward. It's not just about what industry we can get to invest in here, but it's about the investments we're actually making in the people that live here to really see the differences and the measurements of how successful we can be as a state. So I think that's going to be probably the most important thing I take away from this report when I go to the wonderful building called the state capitol and talk with lawmakers every day about that.
Thanks, Devontae. And Erica, what do you take away from this? What are the implications in your work? You're muted.
My phone for audio because I'm a little internet challenged here in New Orleans. So I want to reiterate the thanks to the folks from the Measure of America for this excellent report, and from our perspective, more facts to establish what we already know and see. As direct service providers, as well as policy folks, we are always trying to make sure that we have a picture of the whole person. We have people who come into our office seeking legal services around wage issues and workplace issues, but our approach, both in providing legal services and in doing policy work, is to try to work holistically to address policies that will affect the whole worker, their families, everything, and what vulnerable populations need. So I think that this report helps give us that whole picture, and it also helps us understand what information we need to find from our direct services clients to help direct them to resources beyond what we can provide them. So I think it's going to be, and I reiterate all the things that Ashley and Devontae said about showing where we have made progress, Medicaid expansion being the big one, a little bit of progress in criminal justice reform, and where we have made no progress whatsoever in terms of wage growth, in terms of getting a minimum wage and getting any kind of equity in economic policy for the people of the state.
Thank you, Erica. The next question is also for everybody. All of you can take a turn. This report identifies several areas for investment and action, ranging from training and opportunities to enter and thrive in high demand fields, addressing youth disconnection, closing the digital divide, improving population health and eliminating health equities, and making educational equity a reality, just to name a few. Could each of you pick one of the recommendations from this report and tell us what you think needs to happen to really move the needle on that issue? And we can start with Erica this time.
I feel like this is a little bit like picking a favorite child. So it's easier to pick the things that were closer to my work area. But I really think we have to focus on this idea of an equitable recovery as we someday move out of COVID, and as we're rebuilding from storms that hit us, we really need to use these opportunities to demand change on multiple levels. And touching on what Ashley said before about really pushing to hear the voices of the community, we need to make sure that community members are involved in planning those next stages and designing those policies, that they can't just come from the policy people who say, this is what we should impose on you. And so I think really looking at things equitably in terms of how do we use our public money and our public voices to generate equity, and making sure that equity is what is achieved, not just spoken about, is what I take away from this.
Yeah. Devontae, you want to go next?
Yes, I think for me, kind of as a higher ed policy person, youth disconnection is key, and we've focused a lot in this state on it, but I don't think we've done it equitably. I think one of the things and the challenges that we have not done is looked at how policy is not race neutral, and how if we're not having a targeted policy initiative for Black young people in the state of Louisiana, we won't prosper. I mean, I think we saw in the report about how Lincoln Parish does great with the two institutions, but we got to look in higher education. I mean, we use TOPS as our gold standard to keep youth connected. But when we dig into TOPS, we realize the program that is over $300 million goes to 43% of families that make over $430,000 a year. 75% of the program is white. The ACT score to get TOPS is 21, but the average Black student makes a 16. So when we are talking about changing and closing the gap of Black disconnection, we got to start with the policy that we think is being equitable when it's really not. And so I think really focusing on very targeted policies to ensure that youth are having the resources. That means fully funding the MFP formula and giving that educational in K-12, but then also making sure that we start investing and not even reinvesting. I just want to invest in need-based aid for students to be able to afford college in the state of Louisiana is going to be very important if we want to actually make the needle on ensuring that they have some connection to either a post-secondary education or some post-credential and degree and certificate programs.
That's a great point. And I keep coming back, Devontae, to this idea, there's nothing natural or inevitable about inequality. Ashley, what is one recommendation in here that you think needs to happen and where we can really move the needle?
I'm with Erica. I've struggled. And also too, I mean, I think that, one of the things that's also really powerful when you look through this whole report is the intersectionality of so many of these issues. And so I think, I agree with Erica around this idea that, we've got to we're in the midst of a humanitarian crisis that is playing out. I think that we have not seen, the full implications of COVID-19 on our economy. We just, did some work with the Center for Planning Excellence and Housing NOLA. And, we are starting to see that the foreclosure crisis is going to follow this eviction crisis that we're already in. And so, certainly the, affordable housing popped up, but I'm going to save that for later on in the discussion, because the one that really hit my heart though, was around the disconnected youth piece. And, and I think that, Devontae kind of covered the higher ed side. And for me, what was really troubling were just some of the numbers around, the fact that we can start as early as, ACEs with these early childhood, adverse experiences, and then work our way to the fact that, in our schools, Black students make up 44% of the student body, but 66% of the suspensions, 72% of the expulsions. And so again, when we talk about, the policy and systems, we're systemically pushing our kids into spaces that, further disconnect them, because, when you're not in school and when you're suspended, it is creating that pathway to the school to prison pipeline. And so the thing that really stood out for me was this idea of how are we going to address juvenile justice and juvenile justice sentencing. And like I said, the through line that was so clear to me from ACEs all the way to, 96% of all of the, youth arrested in New Orleans being African-American, right? Like these things that, again, if, the one thing about data is that it proves that, so do I believe that 96% of all bad kids in New Orleans are just Black youth? I don't think so, right? Like statistically, it's pretty much impossible, but systemically though, right? Like to many of the points that Kristen made in her presentation about the ways in which young Black children find themselves, involved with the juvenile justice system and then further disconnected, in the system. And so to me, one of the things that, really stuck out was the recommendations around addressing disconnected youth and the fact that those, that number has grown and it continues to grow. Which then connects all the way back to, to housing, economic, greater economic opportunity and the ability to earn. And so like I said, so I couldn't really pick. So I just kind of, wanted to at least lift up the through line that kind of spoke to me the most was that around this disconnected youth piece, that we're going the wrong direction. And, I want to remind folks that the statute in Louisiana says that, our youth are not incarcerated or they're not detained, right, as punishment. They're detained so that they can rehabilitate. And, when we push on those policies, even during COVID-19 to try to get those youth released for their health, just for the sheer health reasons, we can never push beyond how is rehabilitation not better in their homes where they're safer and not being exposed to the virus in detained situations. And so I just think over and over again, it just, seems to me that I think, our biggest challenge as I look through all of the things in this report and its recommendations is that we've got to get to some parity on the policy side around the things that really matter. Because again, I think if these numbers were more diverse, if it wasn't just 96% Black youth being arrested in Orleans, we could have a different conversation about what the solution is. As we talk about disconnected youth, if we really were kind of unlocking their access to economic opportunity, so that they could make better decisions and have better opportunities for themselves, like all of those things kind of sat with me, because then it just kind of, spreads into all the other data points about how folks, have less, human, are lower on the human development index, and starting at a really young age. And that's unfortunate. And so I think that that's where we have the greatest opportunity, and the data that just, spoke to me the most, but also radiated into all of the other data points.
Thanks, Ashley. It's absolutely right. When you look at this, it's overwhelming, and it's hard to pick one place where you really want to focus your energy. We have a question from the audience that came in, and I want to address it to everybody, or if somebody wants to take it on. It says, our panelists are all providing wonderful policy priorities. We obviously live in a very conservative state. How do we effectively convince some of our more conservative elected officials that we need to act on these issues? It feels like our state just cannot get out of the status quo. This is a timely question because several of us, Devante spent a lot of time at the Capitol. I know Erica did as well. Ashley and her people are up there all the time. So who wants to take this one?
I can start. I mean, I think, first of all, I think we have to think broadly about, is our state actually conservative in that term? We know almost more than and the LSU Riley Center does a great kind of survey every year, a poll. We know minimum wage is extremely popular in this state. We know Medicaid expansion was extremely popular in this state. So it's not that the people of this state disagree with the policy objectives that we know would move the needle to make our state more equitable. It is the leadership. And so for me, we have to change the guard, because the guard right now is what's holding back change. And so that means we have to be very upfront and visible and forceful this upcoming or next year in redistricting, to make sure that people aren't picking who they want to vote for them, that the people of Louisiana get to pick who they want to vote for them. And then we got to start holding these members accountable. I'm at the legislature often, and the thing that you often hear, and I know members who represent East Carroll who will say their district is doing just fine. And we see the data clearly shows it's not. So it is about getting people involved and engaged, and knowing that when we take the power back, we can really make a difference. And I think that's to the great work that Ashley has been doing all across this state and is continuing to do with the Power Coalition. And I know is preparing for the battles we're going to have next year, but we got to restore our democracy. And I think that's the key, because we know the people agree with us. It's just the way that our system is structured right now is holding the state back, and protecting the status quo. And we can break that when we vote, and when we give people the opportunity to participate. So that is letting formerly incarcerated people vote. That is making voting easier, not harder. Attorney General Jeff Landry. And so doing some of those items, and then we'll start to be able to change.
Yeah, Ashley, I don't want to get, it's election time, and I don't want this whole conversation to be about election, but there is this phenomenon that, New Orleans and Baton Rouge tend to be a little bit more progressive, and you get outside the major cities and you get a very conservative legislators, and maybe people who vote for those legislators. Ashley, what can you do to change hearts and minds?
I think, one thing is that, this report that Measure of America has, in this data that they've been able to pull together, is helpful, because sometimes I feel like I'm always proving what I know and hear. Like, one, what I hear is happening to people, what I see and know, or experiences that folks are having in communities on the ground. And so when folks say, again, I think there've been so many polls at this point on raising the minimum wage. I mean, it's over 82% of folks in the state of Louisiana want to raise the minimum wage. 59% want to raise it to $15. So it's, but there's still no will to do it. And I think, part of part of it is like being able to bring truth, facts, and data back to the Capitol, because I feel a little frustrated and probably more than frustrated, but I'll keep it PG-13 this afternoon, that we're not even talking about facts, right? Like that, that even if we look at tort reform, people in Louisiana are hurting. I mean, we've got New Orleans is, one of its major industries is the hospitality industry. Some of those jobs aren't going to come back for 3 years because of COVID. And the reality that like we're allowing folks to, be facing eviction, facing all of these things, and we're working on tort reform and all these other things is crazy. And for them to admit on the other side of tort reform that they really just needed to create a narrative so that their citizens wouldn't be upset about it. That was literally in the newspaper in Baton Rouge and New Orleans about the like the ways in which we're trying to move policy in this state. And that's not, there's no equity in that. And there's certainly maybe even integrity questions as well, is that like this isn't about what you can get people to believe. This is about how are we trying to make our state a better place? How are we trying to move ourselves off the top of every bad list and the bottom of every good list? And in order to do that, we have to hold them accountable. And I think Devontae's absolutely right. Like redistricting is going to be another key piece of this. Again, we have the second largest Black population proportionally, second only to Georgia, but we have one U.S. congressional House district, right? And and I think on the other side of census, what we've also been looking at is that we know the state's Blacker and browner than it's been. St. Bernard Parish has a burgeoning Black community. All of these places, Jefferson Parish is both Black and Latinx folks. And so how are we making sure that we have elected officials that are going to be accountable to and draw lines both at the House and Senate level, and not gerrymander out the voices of people of color, so that when we actually have representation at the Capitol, it is actually representative of the people? Because I agree with Devontae. I mean, we with everybody on our panel today, we do listening tours around the state multiple times, and you guys we're sitting there listening to the realities of all of the data that's in this report, and how we need to continue to fight and move the needle on these issues, but then trying to find the willingness within this body to do that has proven quite difficult, and I think that one of the things that the greatest tool we have is data, and then being able to really move people to start holding their elected officials more accountable, and dealing in facts and truth versus manufactured information about the true impacts of some of these things. Because I think what the Measure of America report has done has made it crystal clear that we've got some problems, and we've been doing it their way for so long, and that way doesn't work. And so this idea that they won't listen to or think about ending statewide preemption and allowing other municipalities, which are closer to community and more accountable to community, to do and make decisions that work best for them. I mean, I could go on forever, but I won't. And so I just think that data is a super helpful piece to just really prove the realities of so many folks in our state, and to keep hammering in to them about it's not getting better. And so what are these solutions? And how are we looking at the superintendent in East Carroll? How are we looking at, bridging the gap between the superintendent and the police chief? Why are youth being, arrested at a much higher rate in this parish in particular? Why is educational attainment at a lower rate? And so I think that there are lots of interventions that we can do now that we can kind of see really clearly through the data. And we just have to keep pushing and holding those folks accountable.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to the prepared questions for our panelists. And these questions are for specific panelists. I'll start with Devontae. Devontae, how can we engage youth as agents for change and partners in our efforts to make Louisiana a place where all residents and every parish can thrive?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an extremely important question. I mean, for those of you who've known me, I've been a youth renegade this state for quite some time. It's kind of weird now that I'm getting to the older portion of the youth population in my 30s. So it's a different, but I think
you're not old.
I'm not saying I'm old. I'm just saying it's when you start this work at 15 years makes you feel a lot old. But I think what we have to do when we talk about getting youth engaged is recognizing that youth want to be committed to people doing the fight. One of the things that I often tell legislators who agree with us, that yes, we may be down in the numbers, but apathy from you produces apathy in our state. And so we have to get back to a place of knowing and showcasing that we are willing to fight for what we know to be true. We're willing to engage in the challenges, in the battles that it takes to move the state forward. I mean, I'm someone who left Louisiana, came back because I recognize we need people here doing the work. And so I think when we are talking about our young population, we got to stop the brain drain. I mean, we got to stop people from going. So that means investing back into our higher education institutions. And then not also investing in higher education, but investing in society. So that is making our communities more accessible and sustainable, so people want to stay here and they don't want to go to an Austin or a Denver or an Atlanta. And so I think the way that we get youth involved is we got to start early, and we got to, one of the things that I've always done, and I've told people, is we have to empower youth to question authority. This state is a very polite state, and we understand that. But when we don't question authority, authority doesn't respond to what needs to happen for people. And so when we instill that you should ask questions to your school board, you should ask questions to your state legislator, you should hold your mayor accountable for investments in youth development and youth community centers and programming. We should make sure that we empower youth to be part of budgetary discussions, civic engagement processes, looking at hopefully maybe letting 16 to 18-year-olds vote in municipal elections. We have to create that avenue to get young people involved, because oftentimes we expect them to be like me, who's just gonna bulldoze their way into the door, whether you want me there or not. And that's not the case. And so I think it is really creating and using our organizations as avenues to build the pipeline of the next generation of policy leaders, think tank leaders, civic engagement leaders, and people to really kind of hold accountable and really build people-centered power. And I think that's how we really get young people and youth involved.
Thank you, Devontae. The next question goes to Ashley. Ashley, in order to close the gaps in well-being and opportunity, as well as address the root causes of inequities, we need to accelerate our progress. From an organizing and advocacy lens, what lessons learned from social justice movements in Louisiana can inform our work to advance human development?
Sure. And I apologize. I've got a phone ringing in the background that I have no idea whose it is because mine is right in front of me. But no, I think to answer that question, Jan, is that, so we've been doing a lot of movement work, and again, and I've had the pleasure of working with you and Erica and Devontae to move the needle on so many of these things. And so whether it is fighting for economic opportunity through, through ending statewide preemption on minimum wage or paid sick leave or equal pay, even though we haven't seen, the wins, I think that it is becoming more and more a conversation that cannot be avoided, right? And so I think that it's about how are we continuously building a conversation where our legislators are clear that we're not going away. And then also reflecting back to those folks that we're touching every day, that we're talking to, and that we are actually accountable to Devontae's point, like this people-centered approach. It's like, yes, I heard you, and not only did I hear you, but I'm fighting for you. And I have two examples that I think, prove the point. And so one is around criminal justice reform. There is, in the beginning, it was just like, okay, Vote will tell you that folks, they started out by mapping families, right? Like, so here's this one incarcerated person, but I want to know who your mama, your auntie, your brother, whomever, so that we can talk to them about policy reform and change, and them voting and their voice, right? So that they can speak for you because that person, unfortunately was incarcerated. And then they started to move the needle. They were able to keep their promises. They were able to, they were starting to see wins. And in those wins, their base and the amount of folks that they can move at this point is unbelievable, right? Because it is this thing about doing what you said you were going to do, about being consistent, and about centering directly impacted people, and not, just the folks that are smart enough to come up with the solutions. That has really been able to create a movement that, that is going to hold the line around what is, that sustained and continued criminal justice reform. And I think that the same thing is true around voting rights. I mean, I think that, we have been fighting and fighting to make sure that everybody had the safest from a public health standpoint, way to cast their vote for this election in the midst of COVID-19. And Louisiana, kind of always, unfortunately, having higher numbers. Thankfully, many of the things that the governor and several of the mayors have put in place, we are not in the second wave, even as our legislature fights to get us into this second wave with COVID-19. But for the election specifically, we were able to sue the Secretary of State around his emergency election plan, get 3 additional days of early voting, which at this point, it's been the highest early voting turnout. I mean, almost 964,000 plus voters, were able to early vote and have their votes cast. But then also too, the 5 COVID reasons for requesting an absentee ballot also stood. And so, in a state that, as we look at some of the health disparities and some of, again, better and better access to health care, but still, lots of folks with underlying conditions, lots of folks that are caretakers for folks with underlying conditions, being able to have that, I think, it was really critical. And so so now we see this unprecedented turnout on early voting, but then also too, even in our own everyday work, we've seen so many folks reaching out to us just saying, thank you. Like we needed this. This was important. This was about public safety. This was about public health. Like my vote or anyone's vote shouldn't be about partisan politics. My access to my vote and my voice should be a straight path that was clearly fought for many generations before me. And so I think that, what we're starting to see is that folks are like, oh, like this is what we actually have the power to do. And this is what we actually have the power to change. And so when I look at the movement work that's been building, it's really about connecting people back to their elected, officials, those decision makers in their community that are making decisions about their lives every single day. And I think COVID has created this bubble where we are more aware than ever who's deciding, how safe we are, how healthy we are, and what jobs we have access to, whether our children are, have the things that they need. And so I think that, for us, we're just trying to make sure that we keep folks connected about like how power moves in their communities and how we can keep them moving the needle on the issues that really matter to them. And so for me, when I look at what's been happening around criminal justice and that sustained growth of that social justice movement, mostly because they've, centered directly impacted folks. And the same thing with voting, that folks really did feel like this wasn't a partisan issue. This was about all of our ability to say what kind of leadership we wanted, both, at the local, state, and federal levels. And so, I think that those are 2 examples that stand out to me, that folks can kind of see the realness of what it means to be involved in movement, and then the kind of impact that movement can have if we put our voices together.
Thank you, Ashley. Next question is for Erica, and then we're going to go to closing statements from the panelists. Erica, what type of policy options do you recommend that can expand the freedoms and improve the well-being of Black people in Louisiana, as well as close the gaps in living standards across the state?
Well, I think what has been said, specifically what Devontae said about increasing voting, well, both Ashley and Devontae said about increasing voter access is key to increasing anybody's freedom and well-being. I think I first look at the old standards, raising the minimum wage, equal pay, and addressing the pay gap, both the gender and the racial pay gaps that we have, the need for paid sick leave, the need for paid family leave. Minimum wage is a big one, as Devontae and Ashley both said. I mean, it's well documented that the vast majority of people in the state believe the minimum wage needs to go up. The governor campaigned in both 2015 and 2019 on raising the minimum wage, and he's only trying to raise it up to $8.50, whereas I saw an article the other day, I think it was EPI came out with a study the other day, or a statistic the other day, that the wage rate that was asked for at the March on Washington in 1963 was the equivalent of what $15 an hour would be today. So that's number one. But I also think, and Ashley and Devontae have heard me say this a whole bunch of times, because we've all been in the fight to roll back the state's preemption of local minimum wage and local leave laws, is that we really need to use the power that local governments have and that local people have. And this is, I think, a way to improve the well-being of Black people in the state, is to make sure that Black people are in the forefront of making those policy changes in the state. And I think that we can do that by educating community members and building capacity for understanding what happens with our public money. Because I think that the way we can make policy change is through really using public accountability and use of public funds. Community benefits agreements, how do we use tax incentives, or all of these pilot programs that are coming through, is taking public money and not attaching any conditions to it, but just giving it away, usually in ways that end up hurting the Black folks in our communities, the most vulnerable folks in our communities. And so I think that we really need to look at how do we use the power of contract, the power of those relationships, to leverage those political and contractual relationships to our own money to make it work for us.
Thank you, Erica. We are getting close to the end of our program here. I have a couple of questions that I'm not going to get to. So I want to give every one of our panelists a couple of minutes just to give any kind of closing thoughts before we turn it back to Kristen. So who wants to start? Devante?
Sure. I mean, first, it's been a great discussion with my friends and of course you, Jan, my boss. I think when we think about this report, it reminds me of two things: that one, data and facts matter. And we have to acknowledge that it's wild that in 2020 we have to say facts matter, but we have to say facts matter. I saw a question in the chat that we didn't get to about how do we ensure affordability with budget constraints, and this kind of goes to my overall point. We have to recognize that Louisiana is a rich state. We have the opportunity to provide the needs and the resources to every person to be able to prosper in this state. The question is not about whether or not where do we find resources in financial resources or even in doing the policy work. The major question is, when do we have the willpower to do what is right for people? I think once we change our mindsets and know that, and we focus that the challenges we face in Louisiana is not about resources. We have the resources to make sure every child doesn't go hungry. We have the resources to ensure that everyone has access to affordable housing. We have the resources and the knowledge to make sure that everyone makes a living wage and are paid what they are worth. The question that lingers in this state every single day is whether or not we have the willpower to do what is right. And that's what I think we have to focus on. That's the guiding principle. That's the last thing that I want us to remind us. That's why it's important, if you haven't voted, to vote on Tuesday, and not just vote. Voting is where we start. Voting is not where we end. That's showing up at the Capitol if you can. That is emailing lawmakers. That is questioning authority, but recognizing that if we are ready to make a difference and we really want to change the index of people's lives in this state, we got to make the people who want to be leaders have the willpower to do what is right, and not just be able to use resources as an excuse, because we know that's not the reason why they can't do what needs to be done for the people of Louisiana.
So Ashley and then Erica?
I don't even know what else to say after that, Devontae. That was.
You don't have to use the full 2 minutes, but it's up to you.
I'm sorry, Reverend Dr. Devontae Lewis came out. Let me take my Southern pastor roots back away.
I love it. I think for us, I mean, just in closing, like it is one, this, I think this report, kind of validates the realities that we know so many folks that we engage with on the ground and community every day. The realities of what they're facing and what they're dealing with. And I think that, to Devontae's point, that this is about, like, how do we introduce more facts and more information to put in front of our elected leaders and really hold them accountable around, whether it's at the local, state, or federal level, about what are you actually doing for the people of this state. And I think that we've been so business focused for so long, and that we've got to make this shift, and especially because of the compounded issue of COVID-19 and what it does to an already poor, hurting state. that we've got to do some people-centered work, whether we want to or not, or our state's not going to survive. And so, like the misinformation and the, and the company line about business and industry isn't going to, it doesn't hold in the face of, such, kind of stark numbers when we look at, the ongoing impacts of COVID-19 on our economy. And so for me, this is about like, how do we push the needle on, one, you're going to have an opportunity not only to vote, but in addition to what the, the top of the ticket, there's several constitutional amendments on that ballot. We're going to need, and several of those constitutional amendments address some of the things that we've all talked about in terms of what the legislature has the ability to do and their power around the budget, their power around, there's several things. And so pay attention. And, the Public Affairs Research Council has a great guide on the constitutional amendments. If you vote yes, this is what it means. If you vote no, this is what it means. And so I'll definitely drop that in the chat, pull up your sample ballot before you go, because I think that these are the, again, voting is at the heart of this. It's the beginning, it's not the end. And we've just got to keep holding the line around, we're just not going to, stand for, for our needs to not be centered. And I'll tell this one little quick story and I'll shut up. We were fighting at the legislature around the unemployment insurance fund and the fact that it was being quickly depleted because of COVID. And, a lobbyist for the business and industry told us to just wait till January to discuss this issue. We were absolutely going to have to discuss it and address it, but that we needed to wait till January. Well, I don't know any of the folks that I've looked in the face myself, that I've had conversations with families, that are struggling, that can wait till January, right? Like what a privilege to be able to wait till January. And so I just, so for me, this data, gives me, it gives me great pause, but it also gives me something to wield at the Capitol, because I absolutely intend on holding them accountable. And I will certainly make sure that the folks that the Power Coalition is engaging with continues to hold them accountable as well, because again, there's not a whole lot of privilege in so many of our communities, as evidenced by this data, that can wait till January to do anything. And whether that's unemployment, foreclosure, eviction, whatever, we've got to really start to think about what are the answers to these issues, and what are the domino effects and how they're playing out. And so I appreciate the opportunity to share today and to be here with you.
Thank you. Erica.
I want to thank everybody again for this opportunity and for all of this great data. I think we have to be thinking both inside and outside the box. Accountability has been the big buzzword, but I think we have to expand what that means. So I think that we need to look at who our collaborators are in this. And one of the things I think that this report will do will give data across all of these areas of human development to our co-advocates working in education and criminal justice reform and on these issues that I don't spend my time on, but helps us see once again how connected we all are. But the other thing I think it does is shows where we're not making those connections well enough. So for example, we talk a lot about workforce development, but we almost never talk about worker protections when we're talking about workforce development. And I think we need to do that. I think we're not making the connection between small business and the economic realities of low-wage people, because business as a whole has been rolled into the business lobby. And I think we can make those distinctions a lot more clearly. So I think that if we take this data, we take where we have been able to make progress and see where we think a little bit more broadly, we are able to move our place on the Human Development Index and run with that and try to build stronger alliances and think creatively. That's where we need to go.
Well, I want to thank all of you for your time, your wisdom that you gave to this. I want to really thank the Riley Center for partnering with us on this. Obviously, Measure of America and Kristen's whole team for an amazing job. For me, the broad takeaway from this, I mean, there's so much great data in this report, but it really speaks to the idea that if we cannot solve and address racial inequity in Louisiana, we cannot move our economy in the direction that it needs to go. And that if we don't make the investments and the policy choices necessary to move everybody forward and give everybody an opportunity to lead a good, prosperous, and purposeful life of choice and meaning, then what are we doing? So, and I think there's such rich data in here to help make that case. This builds on work that many of us have been doing, that the United Way has been doing with its Alice report. I think there's really the intellectual case, the policy case has been made. I think really it's now up to those of us who are the boots on the ground to make this change happen. So with that, I'll turn it back to Kristen. And again, I want to thank everybody for making this happen.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Jan. And I would like to conclude today with more thanks. First of all, thanks to all of you who tuned in to this. I know you're facing a lot of bad weather there, and we really appreciate your making time for this. I'd like to thank our institutional partners, the Louisiana Budget Project, the Riley Center, the Conrad and Hilton Foundation, and JP Morgan Chase. A special shout out to our amazing panelists who just really, I think, brought the data to life so much more than we would be able to do. So special thanks to Janae, Ashley, Devante, Erica, and Jan. And a final thanks, of course, to our wonderful moderator, MOA's very own Jonas Johnson. Thank you so much, Jonas, for keeping us moving. And yeah, so thanks so much. We plan to have a lot of different kinds of events and trainings and things like that in the future. And we are here for you for anything you want from us about this report, copies of it, questions you have, anything, just reach out to contact@Measure of America, and we will gladly answer you. So thank you so much once again, and stay safe today. Have a great night. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.